My sister has studied the Titanic sinking in depth, and she's shared some of her research with me. I'm frequently amazed by how many little things led to the sinking. If even one of them had been different, it's possible the Titanic would not now be a metaphor for disaster. If they had not forgotten the binoculars for the watchmen, or at least lost them, if a radio operator had passed on all the ice warnings, if they'd paid more attention to the warnings they did receive, if they'd slowed down just a notch or two in the icy seas. If. Whittier said it best, even if his words have now acquired the status of trite repetition. For of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, "It might have been." The story of Paul's final arrest is a classic fit for Whittier's words. On his way to Jerusalem, a group of alarmed Christians met with Paul, and Luke tells us through the Spirit they told Paul not to go to Jerusalem. But Paul felt really strongly that he wanted to go, that he needed to go. And the warning proved accurate. Paul was arrested when he was in Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting that the controversy about Paul was not so much that he was a Christian. It had to do with his relationships with Gentiles. People got wigged out because he had a Gentile traveling companion, and a rumor spread that he'd brought this Gentile into the temple. That would have been considered a terrible sacrilegious defilement of the holiest place in Israelite faith. Paul had not done what he was accused of. I'm sure he had too much respect for the feelings of his fellow Israelites to even consider doing such a thing. But rumors are hard to kill. A large crowd listened to him without any problems when told of his conversion to become a follower of Christ. When they got upset was when he said Christ had called him to reach out to Gentiles. We're talking about Jerusalem here. There was a divide in Judaism at that time. The Hellenistic Jews outside of Israel were open-minded. They were inclined to witness and be in mission to the Gentile world, to share the news of their God and their faith. Now, that wouldn't have seemed so bad to the Orthodox folks of Israel, except that the Hellenistic people weren't very fussy about circumcision, dietary laws, and other rituals for their Gentile converts. And there were a large number of Gentile converts who were attracted, as I've mentioned before, to the spirituality and morality of Yahweh. Now, we sometimes look back to this era and think of it as a simple controversy between Jews and Christians. Some scholars believe, however, that it was actually more of a controversy between Orthodox Jews and Christians on the one side, the ones who wanted the entire Jewish ritual package, and the more liberal Jews and Christians who were willing to let that go. Certainly, the reaction of the crowd supports the scholarly belief. The people only got upset once the Gentiles were brought into it. When Paul was pulled in front of the Sanhedrin, he claimed that he was being persecuted because of his belief in resurrection of the dead. Now, this started the Pharisees into an argument with the Sadducees because the Pharisees believed in resurrection and the Sadducees didn't. Some of the Pharisees stood up and said, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him?" Some old manuscripts add that they expressed a concern that in opposing Paul, they might prove to be opposing God. And that addition, by the way, seems entirely credible. When Peter and some of the Christians were early held before the council, the great Jewish teacher Gamaliel cautioned the council not to do anything against them. He said if they were not of God, their work would not endure. If their work was of God, nothing the council could do would stop it, and they would in fact prove to be working against God. Some of this spirit might certainly have remained years later, as some Pharisees wanted to leave Paul alone. If only their words had been heeded. What might have been if people had listened? But instead, this dissension grew violent, and Paul remained in custody. A group of his enemies then bound themselves with an oath to ambush Paul as he was being transferred from one place to another. They vowed to neither eat nor drink until they had killed him. Unfortunately for them, Paul's nephew heard about the plot, carried the news to Paul, who had him report it to the Roman authorities. The Roman authorities were already aware that Paul was a Roman citizen, so they transferred him to Caesarea. And this was a case where what might have been turned in Paul's direction. We're never told, by the way, what happened to those 40-plus men who had vowed neither to eat or drink until they had assassinated Paul. You have to wonder, did they keep their promise? The Roman governor Felix was actually quite knowledgeable about Jewish matters. He kept Paul in custody for 2 years, and they talked during that time. Luke says he did not release Paul because he was hoping for a bribe. Of course, it might equally have been a matter of keeping the peace. Jesus was sacrificed to the Roman desire to keep things under control in a troublesome province. Paul may have fallen victim to the same administrative desire. When Felix was replaced with Festus, that's when things changed. Festus was not at all knowledgeable about Israelite matters. Scholars say, however, that the records we have of him indicate he was a thoughtful and conscientious governor. Desiring to settle the matter, he offered to send Paul back up to Jerusalem. Paul knew the fate that awaited him there, so he appealed to Caesar. Paul was Roman citizen by birth. This bestowed certain rights on him. For example, he could not be beaten to coerce a confession out of him. He used that right when he was first imprisoned in Jerusalem. A citizen also had the right to not take a local judgment. He could appeal to the emperor for a hearing. Of course, Paul wanted to go to Rome anyway, but he had wanted to go under his own steam. While he was waiting to be transferred to Rome, King Agrippa came to visit Festus. Agrippa II was related to King Herod. His loyalty was firmly in the Roman camp, but he appears to have had some sympathy and knowledge concerning Judaism. Paul certainly gives him credit for that. Agrippa was curious about Paul, so Festus offered him the opportunity to hear Paul's case. Paul stood and spoke about his conversion, preached a sermon about Jesus as part of his defense. Festus, with no knowledge of Judaism, well, he thought Paul was simply nuts. But Paul did not respond with anger. He directed his words to Agrippa, again giving him credit for knowing the prophets and even believing in them. And Agrippa leaned forward and said something that's puzzled scholars for years. "Are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christian? Or in so short a time do you think to make me a Christian? Or with so little effort, perhaps, with such flimsy evidence?" King James Bible translates it as, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." Now, some scholars think Agrippa was just being sarcastic, and that's a hard thing to translate, of course. A man in chains trying to persuade him to his faith? What a ridiculous thing to do. It's hard to be laughed at when we are speaking about things that matter most to us. That's a condition Christians have often had to endure. Paul himself pointed out that the cross seems foolishness to worldly ways of thinking. So if Agrippa was being sarcastic, you've got to admire Paul's answer. He didn't try philosophy, he didn't try clever legal tricks, or anything else. He cut right through the sarcasm and agreed. Yeah, he wanted Agrippa to be a Christian. He wanted them all to be Christians, just like him. Except he wouldn't wish those chains on anyone. But what of other scholars who think that Agrippa might have been expressing an ambivalent, wistful desire to believe what Paul had told him? Imagine, did he come that close and then back off? What a sad picture. Of course, we know people back off of Christian commitment for many reasons. Even committed Christians may adjust the depth of their commitment for various motives. But was Agrippa attracted to the faith and then back off because he might have to change his lifestyle or his priorities or maybe his relationships? Did he back off and refuse to exchange his fool's gold for the real thing? Did a small corner of his heart believe and nibble on him for the rest of his life? We'll never know. That's between him and God. We don't get the answers to what if and what if it might have been. Festus and Agrippa did agree that Paul didn't deserve to be in prison. They would have released him, but Paul had appealed to the emperor. Once that appeal was made, it could not be changed. Paul would go to Rome. He would be in prison there for at least 2 years, and we have no idea what happened to him after that. We don't know if he died in prison from the health problems that apparently plagued him for years. We don't know whether he was released and went on to Spain as he had once hoped. We don't know whether he was martyred as a witness to his faith. My imagination can conjure 1,000 scenarios for it might have been. What if Paul hadn't gone to Jerusalem? What if the people had been more open to the Gentiles? What if Felix or Festus or Agrippa had believed? What if the emperor heard Paul and believed? All sorts of things might have been. But no matter what might have been, no matter what had happened, one thing would have happened, the same thing that actually did happen. God was there, God is there, and God is love no matter which way the wind blows. The witness to Christ remained true. The good news was not stopped. However and whenever it was that Paul did come to the time of death, we can make a very good guess that he went to meet his Lord with joy. Amen.